Ready? Ready? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Today's shir is sponsored by Zeich Nishmas Tzvi Yehuda ben Eliezer Zal and Sham Shav and Aliyah. As follows. I want to talk about shaving on Chol HaMoed, which was it was a great fight. That's really the way to say it. It was a great fight because the Psak came from Nodah Yehuda, who's an iconic, legendary Psak, and the chalkim on him were sometimes smaller than him by by degrees, smaller than him by a whole area. So it makes for a very interesting machlekes. But I want to start from a shtickle different mahalach. We've spoken in the past about Napoleon and the Jews. Now the angle that we spoke about it from was the Chassidim and Napoleon. By the Chassidim there was like a fight if we should daven for Napoleon to win or should daven for Napoleon to lose, because Napoleon brought allegedly freedom, and the Chassidim, who were living in Ukraine under the Russian Tsars, lived under terrible, terrible restrictions. So it was like a machlekes or Mendel of Rimanov, the Baal Tanya. The Baal Tanya ultimately dies running away from Napoleon. The Baal Tanya, the Lubavitch Chassidim believed that the Baal Tanya stole Napoleon's victory march. There's a song on Yom Kippur, Mitzvah Yom Kippur, I think Chabad sings a march that's called Napoleon's March. And in Chabad they say that the Baal Tanya stole Napoleon's victory march, and that's why he didn't win ultimately. This story is about Rosh Hashanah. There's a lot of different, inyanim with Chassidim and Napoleon. Now, there's a group of Jews who were more directly impacted by Napoleon. I'm going to call for the sake of this, the shmooze, Napoleon's Jews, and that's where shaving will come in. Now, in 1806, Napoleon gathered together a conference of hundreds of rabbis and pretend rabbis and fake rabbis from all over his empire at the time. He summoned them to Paris, and he was going to have a conference to discuss Judaism, to discuss Judaism. Now, essentially what he was doing was like a very clean form of anti-Semitism. Because Napoleon said as follows, and we have from his private letters, Napoleon said that Judaism is not worth saving. Jews deserve liberty, Judaism deserves nothing. Lamashal. When Napoleon told people that he's having this get-together, make sure to have enough Freya people who don't care about the Torah, but also make sure, he says, to bring some kanoim, some frumah rabbanim, who will have the good sense to realize that if they don't go along with what I'm suggesting over here, they're going to be banished from all my lands. He writes that very clearly. So Napoleon understood what he was doing. He's like leveraging the fraya against the frumah to get everybody on board for a watered-down form of Judaism that would be like state-sanctioned. So it was a very classy form of anti-Semitism that Napoleon was engaging in. Now, in 1806, he summons them, and Jews at that time, some of the Jews upon him thought Napoleon was Mashiach. Napoleon was conquering the whole world. He was, engaging with the Jews. There's many letters from different Rabbanim, even some of them, Grace Rabbanim, who referred to Napoleon as Mashiach, and, they thought he was something very special. A real change of events was transpiring. Now, Napoleon summons them, and they have a song that they made up to sing about him, and he presents them with 12 shilas that he presents to the Sanhedrin. Not the Sanhedrin, he presents 12 shilas to this group of Grace Rabbanim. Now, the 12 shilas that he presents, I'll read them off quickly, is shilah number 1, he says, if he wants to know, is it mutter al pidas Yisrael to marry more than one lady? Question number 2 is a get. Is there such a thing as a divorce in Jewish law? And how does that work with when the government doesn't allow a divorce? Meaning if there's no state sanction for a divorce, could Jews still divorce? Question number 3, is a Jew allowed to marry a non-Jew? Question number 4, how do Jews look at Frenchmen? Do they consider them goyim, nachrim, outsiders? Questions. And more, I'm not going to read all 12 of them, but they're all basically to discover and flesh out exactly how Jews look at the Gentiles, how Jews look at their laws versus the laws of the people around them. He wants to know if they're loyal to their nation that they're in now. Will they fight in wars for their nation? All sorts of questions about loyalty, about where the Jews fit into French society. Now, this kinus of Jews, who very well understood the predicament that they found themselves in, who very well understood that if they didn't, conform to what Napoleon wanted from them, they could suffer grave consequences. So they, kind of thread the needle. Not everything is actually halachically ois gehalten from the 12 answers that they gave. Not everything is halachically ois gehalten, but most things are not halachically not ois gehalten. They're like threading through gray area. They're trying very careful to give answers that are suitable, but that are not l'mashal. The question number 1, so they say takanus rabbeinu gershon. You're not allowed to have more than one wife. Question number 2, they say a Jewish get could only work if the government sanctions it. Now that's probably not the halacha, but it's not the halacha. They're not changing what a get is. They're just saying you can't give a get unless the government allows it. Like a dina d'malchus adina, like imposing a separate law on top of the law. U'chayina v'chayina. Now, these answers, although the keenest of Jews who were there were not all from a Jews by a long stretch. Some of them were not even Rabbanim. Some of them, they were just, some of them were jokes. But by and large, the top three, the people, the Av Bezdin and the Rashi Sanhedrin of this group of Jews were very frum. I'll talk about it in a second, but this group, this Kines in 1806, eventually Napoleon decides that in order to make these answers like institutionalized and to make them stick so that they'll have better sticking power, he wants to convene an official Sanhedrin. And Napoleon convenes a Sanhedrin in 1807, 1808. He convenes a Sanhedrin that meets in the House of Parliament in Paris and is given a special, Sanhedrin uniform. And every painting that we have of the Dayanim from the Sanhedrin is, very interesting hats that they're wearing, and some of the arguments that are done in front of the Bezdin, they're wearing powdered wigs. These are sometimes the Rabbanim, wearing powdered wigs while they debate halachic law in front of the Sanhedrin. So Napoleon, in order to ensure that these answers had sticking power and that they were actually representative of what Yiddishkeit was, he made a Bezdin, and ultimately Napoleon paskined that the Bezdin came to sufficient, conclusions, and he allows Jews to stay in Paris, though he does pass some anti-Semitic laws, where he limits Jews from certain businesses, and limits Jews from living in certain places. So Napoleon actually turns out to be pretty much a regular anti-Semite in the vein of anti-Semites, but he had like a classier form of a softer touch, classier anti-Semitism than the regular anti-Semitism. Now, the Av Bezdin of this was someone by the name he was referred to as the Yad David. He's Rabbi Yosef David Tzinsheim. Rabbi Yosef David Tzinsheim was an Ashkenazi Jew, a Yekisher Jew. He was born in, I think, Metz maybe, or somewhere else. He learned in Metz, certainly. He corresponded with the Nodah Yehuda, the Shagas Aryeh, the Chassam Sofer. He was an upstanding Ashkenazi Rav. Eventually he becomes a Rav in Strasbourg, which is part of France, and then eventually he becomes the chief rabbi of Paris. Now Paris at that time had like a kehillah of, I think, 40,000 Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. It was not from the biggest kehillahs in Klal Yisrael, but it was a sizable kehillah. And Rabbi David Tzinsheim becomes the Rav. Now Rabbi David Tzinsheim, because he was the Rosh Bezdin of Paris, was chosen by Napoleon to be the head of the Sanhedrin. Rabbi David Tzinsheim is most famous, he's most famous for, as he's referred to as the Yad David, because when he was a Rav in Strasbourg, so France, in 1898, France has a revolution, right? They overturn their kings, they kill their kings, and then they embark on a few years of what was called the Reign of Terror. Now, the Reign of Terror was basically, they were trying to root out anybody who was not, Eisgehalten with the revolution, and they had the guillotine, and they killed thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people who weren't in line with what they were preaching. And there was a big persecution of religions, b'chlal, not just Jews. Religious persecution became very popular during the Reign of Terror. Now, during the Reign of Terror, Reb David Tzinsheim has to run away from Strasbourg with all his ksavim, and he makes a neder that should Hashem decide to save him and his ksavim survive, he's going to publish all his svarim. He had a yam of ksavim, he published all his svarim. Ultimately, he survives, and I think he publishes, it's either 14 or 16 or 18 volumes of Yad David al-Shas. It's not the most popular sefer in the whole world, but it's a very substantial sefer. Today it was printed, I think Machon Yerushalayim published it sometime a few decades ago. So he has many, many, many svarim. Now, his svarim are regular lamdis, halacha, very regular svarim. Now, this job that he got, that he was selected to be the Rosh Bezdin of the Napoleon Sanhedrin, was a little bit like a fish out of water for him. He was a pretty traditional rabbi, corresponded with the regular rabbis, very traditional, and he got forced into this job. Now, by all accounts, he did an amazing job at it. He kind of threaded the needle between giving answers that were iskal and that weren't terrible. Ad kedei kach that the Chassam Sofer, when Rabbi David Tzinsheim was nifter in 1808, the Chassam Sofer gave a hesped that's published in the what do you call it? The Chassam Sofer is drushes, and drushes the Chassam Sofer says as follows. I'll read you just a little quote what he writes about him. He says the person, the tzaddik that we're talking about, who were oiskim behesped, he says Harav Again Meirenu Rav David Zatzal Zinsheimer Ba'al Mechaber Sefer Yad David Asher B'Hiyosim Mechubed V'Karev Moed L'Malchus B'Paris. He was mechubed and very close to the king in Paris. V'nishal al kama dvarim. He was asked about many things. V'heishav shayil of davar. He answered properly. V'yagadol mechubed ma'oid b'einei melech v'asarim. He was very, very well respected b'einei the melech and the sarim. V'kavod asalev b'moisik yedua b'chol zois. He says even though he was someone who was karv l'malchus and he had to answer all these questions, he says b'chol zois hayagadol Yehudim. He was still a gadol Yehudim. Oisik kol yama b'tayr v'hichzir shas kama pamim. Now this is just interesting. I noticed this line. The Chassam Sofer writes like his Maila, he chazard shas a few times. I'm assuming the Chassam Sofer means, Be'i and Rav, but he learned through Shas a few times. It's just an interesting type of attribute that the Chassam Sofer says about him. V'chol Sifrei Rishonim v'Achronim Mamash Shkurim B'Fiv K'nir Misifrav U'Makiri Hiyesi B'Yaldusei. He says, so he writes, he was, that Rav David Sintai was someone who was able to thread the needle. He was able to be Makor of Lamalchus, a court Jew, a state Jew, someone who could work with Napoleon and his henchmen. And he was also able to be someone who was Gadol Ba'achav also. He was a Talmud Chacham, a Paisik, a Talmud Chacham, Chaber Svarim. Now, why am I talking about him? What does this have to do with our topic of shaving? So as follows. I'll get to the Nodah in a second, but the Nodah had a famous kula, where the Nodah wanted to be makel for someone who shaved already on Erev Yom Tif. Someone who shaved the Erev the first days, and comes in clean shaven, and then comes Chol HaMoed. The Nodah had a heter, and we'll go through the rationale soon, that you're allowed to get shaved again on Chol HaMoed, which is a big chiddush, and it's connected to Shulchan Aruch. So, now, there was amongst the Bnei Dairi of the Nodah Gedolim who pushed back on the Nodah and argued with him. Most of them were his relatives, his Mechutanim. One of them was Rav Segel, was a Mechutan Nodah, Rav Shaul Amsterdam, Rav Tzvi Arsh Levine. These are all relatives, compatriots of the Nodah, and they all pushed back, and we'll get to some of their points. Now, but one of the most elaborate, takedowns of the Noda's tshuva was the Yad David, of David Sinsaim. David Sinsaim and Yad David on Moed Katan, on Mesechtas Moed Katan, on the sugi that talks about shaving, he goes through an elaborate dismantling of the Noda's heter, piece by piece, every single thing, and he also sent it to the Nodah in a kuntras that he mailed the Nodah after Noda's first volume of Tshuvas came out. In 1776, after Nodah published Chelik 1 of Nodah, David Sinsaim sent him a kuntras with critiques, and in there was a long, strong disputation against the Noda's heter for shaving on Chol HaMoed. Now, why is this so consequential? And to me, this just highlights the predicament that possibly the Nodah found him in, meaning it just highlights a little bit why certain people were saying certain things. Rav David Sinsaim in 1806, when they were called to the conference in Paris, it ended up being over Yom Tif. They were called on Rosh Chodesh Elul, was the first day of the conference, and it lasted about 2 months, so that Sukkos, most of the Rabbanim, including Rabbanim from Italy and France and Germany and Poland, and many Rabbanim who ended up there over Yom Tif, ended up in Paris over Yom Tif. Now, a lot of those Rabbanim, especially the ones from Italy, were in the habits of shaving. Now, someone who has a beard, Rav David Sinsaim had a beard. He didn't have a mustache, but he had a beard, so he shaved his mustache. But he had a mustache, he had a beard. So if you have a beard and you trimmed before Yom Tif, comes Yom Tif a few days later, you don't look that much different. It's not really a big deal. But if you're someone who shaves and you're coming dressed up in your powdered wig and you're being very official for the conference in the House of Parliament in Paris, and suddenly you have a 3-day stubble, a 4-day stubble, it becomes very problematic. And many of the Rabbanim who found themselves in Paris over Sukkot in 1806 wanted to shave. They wanted to employ this heter of the Nodah and others and be samech on it. Now, the Rav that they asked the question to was the Rav Hanan al-Nifi. He's an Italian Rav. He wrote a sefer called Shut Levayas Chain. It's in the Tshuvas, you could read it. Now, the Rav Hanan al-Nifi goes through the Inyan, and he's Noit Kav to be Mekel, and he says, it's Karv Lamalchus, these people need to be working here, they have to look presentable, and he's, Noited to be Mekel, that they could shave on Chol HaMoed, have someone shave them on Chol HaMoed in this predicament that they find them. Now him, unknowing that Rav David Sinsaim was a huge opponent of this heter, he forwarded his tshuva to the Av Bezdin of the Paris get-together, who he was working under. He forwarded him his tshuva and said, here, just look over this tshuva that I wrote about the members of the Bezdin shaving on Chol HaMoed. And now Rav David Sinsaim found himself between a rock and a hard place. Because you can't write a 5-page disputation arguing the Nodah heter strongly and then turn around and say it's mutter, but you also can't say it's usher when you're in the situation, when you're in the Paris, when you find yourself in this predicament. So to which Rav David Sinsaim attaches a small addendum to Rav Hanan al-Nifi's tshuva, which is published in the Levayas Chain, where he kind of agrees, but he also says you really shouldn't if you don't have to, and a much more muted critique, a much more delicate and non-harsh critique of this heter. To which Rav Hanan al-Nifi writes a third letter and back and forth, and there's about 4 or 5 tshuvas in the Levayas Chain that are dedicated to the walking back of Rav David Sinsaim's strong critique of the Nodah. Now, there's nothing shver about this, meaning this was a Greisa Shasad Chak. These were Kreven L'Malchus. There's many rayas from Chazal and from different sugyas that Kreven L'Malchus have more heterim than everybody else. And there's no problem with the rationale that Rav David Sinsaim, who held that in a normal situation it was aser, would hold that it's mutter over here. To me, this just highlights the predicament that different Rabbanim found themselves in, and maybe why some were able to be machmer, much more openly, and some had to be much more delicate when they go to this. So now let's come to Nodah. The Nodah was a Rav in Yampala. It's a small Polish town. He probably never saw a Jew who shaved when he lived in Yampala. In 1740, 1750, he probably never saw a Jew shaved. He gets to Steller in Prague, he moves to Prague, and now everybody shaves. He comes to Prague, and the Nodah can't believe his eyes. He gets there to a Kehila full of geshavene people. Now the Nodah did not hold it was Asar al Pidin to shave, to trim with a Misbrayim Kain Tar. He held it was Asar with the tar. Now we know that the Nodah was taken aback and was a big deal for him because when the Nodah gets to Prague, some of the earliest drushes and Nodah and drushes Atzlach are a meeting that he had on Erev Leil Slichas, meaning the first night we say Slichas, Mitzi Shabbos, Leil Slichas, Erev Rosh Hashanah. He gathered together all the barbers in town, the Nodah, and he gave them direct instructions on what what no, how they're allowed to trim people, how they're allowed to shave people, payis, beard, v'chulu. So clearly the Nodah felt like this was one of his, like walking in the door, this was one of the biggest concerns that he had, was how to take a kehila that seemingly was nichshel and shaving and get them within the confines of halacha. There's another shuvah where the Nodah suggests, the shayil suggests, and the Nodah hedges on it, that someone who shaves with a razor, so the hair is mamish cut down to the base, and then every day he just trims with a misparayim kain tar, the shayil suggests that maybe you're not over the issur of shaving every day. Meaning shaving is only when there's hair grown to a certain amount, to call it 0.2 millimeters, whatever it is, and you shave that off, then you're over the issur of shaving. But if you have some sort of very, very little stubble that doesn't really count yet, you're not over. Now the Nodah still says it's asr, but only midrabanan. So you see the shaylas, the zeitgeist that the Nodah was faced with, and trying to figure out how shaving, what the coolest are, what you could work with. Now the Nodah, when he was faced with this question of shaving in Chalamayid, so in his later tshuvas he writes that 15 years ago I was approached by someone who wanted to know, he shaved on Erev Yom Tov, meaning he trimmed on Erev Yom Tov, now comes Chalamayid, he wants to trim again. Is he allowed to or not? So Nodah writes that I was makel for him. This is interesting, like a little bit into the mindset of Nodah. Nodah said I was makel for him, but I didn't tell him the reason. I made it sound like it was something mamish that I thought of special for him based on his circumstance, so that he shouldn't go and tell anybody else about it. He shouldn't, spread this around to anybody else. I made it sound very, very specific to him, so that he should have to, this is not something you can go share with anybody else. So now the Nodah was faced with the idea of people who are shaving, always shaving on Chalamayid, and the Nodah is trying to work with them and give some sort of heter. Now, ad kedei kach that the Nodah, in one of these tshuvas, I'll read from them in a minute, the Nodah writes that he wasn't sure if he should publish this tshuva, mitama kamos etzlei. He wasn't sure if it was right to share this tshuva or not, because of reasons that he's not going to share. And the Chasam Sefer in a tshuva about this, Nodah writes, ani hoylech rachel megala seid. The Nodah writes that he's keeping it secret. I'm going to tell you the reason. The reason is, and he says based on this other Nodah, he says the reason is that people in the Noda's kehila would shave with a razor once, and then they would just keep it going with a trimmer. And the Nodah felt that if I let them grow a beard over Yom Tov, by the time Mitzvah Yom Tov comes, they're going to be over the lav of shaving with a real shaver. With a real shaver. It's like this, Chach will be makel on the Derabanan of not shaving on Chalamayid, at least they shouldn't be over on the Deraisa of real shaving with a tar. Now, Lamaisa, that's probably not what the Nodah is actually going with, because he writes a lot himself, what he's holding with, and many others, critique the Chasam Sefer about that. But Yiach Shia, that's the Nodah's Psak. Now, there's just one interesting line that I want to read. The Chida, who wrote about this many times, the Chida writes about shaving on Chalamayid 7 times in his Svarim, throughout his prolific, writing in his Svarim. But in one of them he writes, and this is just a quote that caught my eye, he writes that, one second. He writes as follows. This is in Shema Gedolim, when he writes about the Nodah. He writes about the Nodah was, God Ladar. He says, Ve'im be'inyan hagiluach not a kav. The Nodah, strayed from the mainstream when it came in regards to shaving. Mikal makam ha'chacham b'chachmasay yakir b'sifra. A chacham who was reading his Svarim could know ki ravhu umufle migdele hadar. Would be able to tell that he's big, and he's bigger than everybody else. He's bigger than all the Gdele Hadar. Goy no Yistilas Yisrael, but Oisis man Kasa B'Sifri Machzik Bracha, and then the Chida writes Machzik Bracha, Hayroze Kulo Mukshe, Lasis Arab Biyad Dallas Amaretz, Vagamani Shamati Eish Yatzas Ameherazu, Shamoinam Yimtzu Pesach L'Hakal B'Yisurim, the Kamagdel Devacham, that's he writes. Now, in the third place, the Nodah writes, this is the part that I wanted, I forgot, I'm not finding now, but he writes that this psak was so out of the ordinary, out of the norm, that people asher einem ru'uyim lekreis talmidei talmidav chalku olav, people that are not worthy of being called talmidei talmidim of the Nodah, meaning the merchak between the Nodah and his chalkim. And he's referring to some Italian rabbanim who published long, angry chuvas, aggressive chuvas. Says these are people not worthy of being referred to as talmidei talmidav of the Nodah, or chelik on him, strongly. So this was like a very outside the pale psak from the Nodah Yehuda. I'm just trying to show it in context, meaning what the Nodah Yehuda was dealing with, and how you see even when David Sinsheim, faced with similar questions, also started, being more makel at the psak. Now so what is the psak? So the basic idea is as follows. The Mishnah Meit Katan says, and Daf Yud Gimel Beis, the Mishnah brings a list of exceptions of who's allowed to shave in Chol Hamoed. It says, Ve'elu megalchen b'moed, habami medina sayam, beis hashivya, v'yotzim beis asurim, v'amanodah shetir lechachamim, and it gives a short list of people who had no ability to shave in Erev Yom Tov. They were either locked away or unable to shave in Erev Yom Tov, so therefore they're allowed to shave in Chol Hamoed. Now the Gemara brings a rationale for this. What's the cheshbon advarim? It says the Gemara that it's a svara. Chazal didn't want shalei kanas l'regel kishum menuvel. They were afraid that if they allow you to shave in Chol Hamoed, Erev Yom Tov is a very busy time. You're not going to get around to trimming your beard, to shaving your hair, to doing whatever you have to do. You'll come to Yom Tov as overgrown, and then Chol Hamoed, when you're relaxed and you have a laid back few days, you'll shave. So therefore, it's going to be a negative thing to cover Yom Tov. So Kadesh Leikanos Yom Tov Kishum Novel, they didn't allow you to shave on Chol Hamoed. Now, Zayis gepaskint in Shulchan Aruch, in Roiv Rishonim, Lahedya, that shaving on Chol Hamoed is aser. Straight, that's pretty straight. Now, in the Torah, in Sim Tavkuf Lamed Aleph, in Sif Beis, the Torah brings as follows. The Torah brings a chiddush. Says the Torah, Rabbeinu Tam Pirish, Kivin Shezeu Atam. Since the reason is Kadesh Leikanos Yom Hamoed Kishum Novel, we don't want you to come into Chol Hamoed, disgusting. Im Kainim Gilach Kaidem Hamoed. Here's Rabbeinu Tam. This is the precursor to the Nodah Yehuda. Rabbeinu Tam says, since the reason is you shouldn't come into Yom Tov Kishum Menovel, if a person did it in Erev Yom Tov already, then you're ready to come in Menovel, so it's just Chol Hamoed, you could do it, you could shave, this is not a serious malacha. Now, says the Torah, V'kasha Moed Lahater. It's very shver to be semich with Rabbeinu Tam. V'gam einay nirikein mitech Gemara. The Gemara doesn't seem like this. Demisa havali lefartoi, b'hadi hanach tatam ve'elu megalchen. Let the Mishnah include this in the list. The Mishnah could have said, "Umisha gilach b'Erev Yom Tov." Is allowed to be megalech in Yom Tov again. Why did the Mishnah say it? So this can't be pshat in the Mishnah and the Gemara, and you can't be making like this. As like the Torah. Now, the Torah presents it as like a das yachid Rabbeinu Tam. That's mudach from halacha that no one holds like, and that's it. Lamaisa dagois hashri and dagois hashri and dagois maiminis bring this Rabbeinu Tam also. But actually, it does not make it to halacha. And in Shulchan Aruch and Tavkuf Lamed Aleph, not the Mechaber or the Ramah brings this Rabbeinu Tam. They both pass on the head straight out, no exceptions. Shaving, trimming, and Chol Hamoed is aser. As like the Shulchan Aruch. So now, anytime the Shulchan Aruch already get paskin, not like Rabbeinu Tam, it's a little bit hard to reach back into history and say, but we have a daya from a long time ago to be Semchan, which is exactly what the Nodah Yehuda does. And Nodah Yehuda in Arachayim Madura Kama Shuvi Yud Gimel, the Nodah Yehuda says he was asked about shaving a Chol Hamoed, where not to shave yourself, but you're going to have a pile ani shave for you. A poor worker who needs the parnasa, the job in Yom Tov, on Chol Hamoed, will shave for you. Says the Nodah Yehuda as follows. The Nodah Yehuda tries to say, he brings him in a tam, that since the Svarah Shleikanos of the Yom Tov Kishum Novel, so therefore it's mutter if you trim before Yom Tov. And then he says, the Rishonim Kasha, that the Mishnah should have said it. Why is there no exception in the Mishnah? So there the Nodah Yehuda makes a chiddush. Says the Nodah Yehuda as follows. There's really two reasons why it's asked to shave on Chol Hamoed. It says, A, it's a malacha. Shaving some sort of malacha. B, there's the Svarah Shleikanos Kishum Novel. Now he says, in regards to being a malacha, anytime there's a payal ani who needs the parnasa, the halacha is that malacha is mutter to do on Chol Hamoed. So a payal ani is allowed to do malacha on Chol Hamoed. So, and in regards to being shleikanos kishum novel, okay, so you shave beforehand. He says, I've asked him a fragin, why does the Mishnah say? He says the Mishnah only means to say things that are general exceptions, meaning that is in every case. This one relies on a very specific case. You have to have shaven before Yom Tov and have a payal ani. You need those two components together to get the heter. Such a nuanced, chilik that wasn't straight up, the Mishnah wouldn't say. And then he takes it a step further. He says, if what I'm saying is true, that this is what Rabbeinu Tam is holding, and he meant to say this type of nuanced kula, then it could be, he says, that all the other Rishonim were chalik and just misunderstood him. They thought Rabbeinu Tam was saying a general heter, to shave on Chol Hamoed, Leikanos Kishum Menovel. But if Rabbeinu Tam is only saying a nuanced heter, like I'm saying, that depends on payal ani and Leikanos together, and that's what Rabbeinu Tam meant to say, then maybe all the Rishonim were chalik and really would agree with him. So he says, there's no machlekes really, and everyone would agree with him, and you can be semich on Rabbeinu Tam. That's what the Nodah Yehuda says. Now, what do you say? Yeah, on the barber. Exactly. It's not a Pailani anymore. Yeah. So this is the Nodah Yehuda. Now, the Nodah Yehuda, this tshuva, he wrote it for himself, in 1860 or something, when the Shah was posted. And now in 1877, he published Nodah Yehuda Kama for the first time, and this tshuva ignited a firestorm. Now, he writes himself that he wasn't sure if he should include this in Nodah Yehuda. He knew that this was going to be something very controversial if he published it, but he decided to do it anyhow. And he started receiving many letters from different poskim, and like we spoke about, arguing in him very strongly. Now, the Nodah Yehuda Madura Tinyana, Nar Chaim, decides to respond to a few of them. He received many more than this. Some of them we know about from other, Paiskin's Chuvas Farm where they wrote to Ned Yehuda, but he decided to respond to a few of them. He responds, first of all, to his Mechutin, Rav Lemel Segel, who the Ned Yehuda's son married Rav Lemel Segel's daughter. And he writes, Rav Lemel Segel wrote to him that it's connected all the Paiskim. Be'ikr says, Inyan zeh timani al shalat hagad lazem midache lekanis bepir to the chukah lekaim divrei yachad b'makom shekala paiskim rishonim v'achronim. Says the Rav Lemel Segel wrote him, what forced you to go into this narrow, corner over here to try to be matzik, Rabbeinu Tam, one shita that no one holds like no rishonim v'achronim hold like v'leineder lidches psak zeh. Befratis he says b'dar parat shebiyamenu yishlacha shepoishim yikashlu gam b'kam enyanam acherim yitzir shematirim neged shulchan aruch. This is an interesting thing. He says, if people are going to see that you're able to be mekel connected to Shulchan Aruch, he says, so maybe then other things, people who don't have a lot of Yerushalayim are going to say, no, it says in Shulchan Aruch, but we can be mekel. He says, why, who forced you to go down this, into this tight spot and be mekel b'chai gavna? And the Nebuchadnezzar goes through his answer and, goes through his tightness and he says, listen, I'm not forcing anybody to listen to me. I myself was mesubik if I should publish this. But lamaisa, tzaddik, I'm saying what's true, and all these things, halavai, like dvarim nechainim like this, they should always say in my name. Then there's a second letter, he writes him back, and then Nebuchadnezzar writes that I don't see anything new. In your second letter, I don't see any new information, I just see loud voices. I don't see anything new in it. This is Nebuchadnezzar writing. He says, Masha chazal l'rishonis be'esik giluach v'chalamayid l're'isi b'dvar v'asag v'chadasha. I don't see anything new here. Rak chayzal l'rishonis. So I'm just going to repeat myself again in the Davar Seif. You could just say your position, I'll say my position. We could do this again and again forever. So he doesn't even answer. He gets like a short 1-paragraph answer. He's not, Then he has a letter over here from Shaul Amsterdam. This is a cousin of his, I think, the Binyan Ariel, the Rav of Amsterdam, Shaul Amsterdam. Him and his brother, Tzvi Levin, the Rav of Berlin, together both wrote very strong chuvas. He sent them to the Nebuchadnezzar, and to them the Nebuchadnezzar writes, interesting, because they're Rav Shaul Amsterdam and his brother Tzvi Levin are Gedolei Hadar. You know what I'm saying? It's not for me to say on the caliber of the Nebuchadnezzar, but Gedolei Hadar. You know what I'm saying? Gedolei Hadar. And to them he writes, he says, when I published my chuvas, I was never publishing it for people like you, he says. You know how to learn. Go pass whatever you want. I'm publishing my chuvas for people who don't know how to learn as well as me. If you know how to learn as well as me and you think something different, so write your own chuvas. That's what he writes to them. He says, I never said you have to accept my position. This is my position. You don't have to. It's a position. You don't have to accept it. And then he writes, this appears to me. This is what the Necham Sefer is going in this tshuva, where he writes that I myself was mesupik if I should be mefarsim in this heter or not. But by the time I come, I decided to. He doesn't really go into it, but the Nebuchadnezzar refuses to back down from this tshuva. He stands by it strongly. And Me'ezet HaMshiach, the Nebuchadnezzar himself writes in this tshuva to Rav Shaul Amsterdam that he knows that it's not going to be accepted. And nobody accepts my psak on this, and it doesn't matter. I'm still happy to put my psak out there. He writes that clearly. Because Rav Shaul Amsterdam wrote him, why are you saying a psak that nobody's going to accept anyhow? He says, I'm fine with that. No one has to accept it. And this is the Nebuchadnezzar's position. Now, this machlekes, I'm cherry picking a few of the different flashpoints of this machlekes. This machlekes really predates the Nebuchadnezzar and continues for a long time after the Nebuchadnezzar. Again, primarily by Italian Jews, because that's where this was most relevant, shaving. And those are less interesting to me for this moment, so I'm not going to go into them. Now, there is one more nakuda to this machlekes that I want to go into, but I think we'll save it for next week, is the Besamim Rosh. The Besamim Rosh is a tshuva sefer from Rav Shaul Berlin, who's incidentally a son of Tzvi Berlin. A son of Tzvi Berlin, who's one of the Chalkim over here in the Nebuchadnezzar, is the Besamim Rosh, who writes what is possibly the most sophisticated forgery in the genre of Jewish Svarim. And in it, he writes a tshuva about shaving a chalamayid, and it reignites this fight in a very interesting way, and we'll get to that in Mitzvah Hashem. All right, Ashikayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.